If you will, turn your Bibles over to Exodus chapter 2. Today we're going to talk about something that I think you're going to find very interesting. There are all kinds of books, CDs, classes you can attend that kind of develops self and self-power to help you more confident, to help you to be more successful in business, or your personality to be more successful in sales, or whatever the thing may be. And most of them all deal with being self-aware and improving yourself. And there's nothing wrong with those things. I read those things all the time. But if you're not careful, you can really forget the important thing, and that is actually we need to have, as we're going to see with Moses, a selfless life. Most of us, you struggle with the battle of being pretty well self being the center of our universe. And most all these courses are developed on how aware you are of yourself. Now, you can have abilities and personalities and strengths and intelligence, and those things are great, and we ought to use them. I'm not saying that. But we need to turn them over to God. I want you to notice something that happened to Moses. Now, Moses' life is kind of divided into three different areas. You got the first 40 years of his life in which he is in Egypt. And he is being raised and trained and schooled by the best. He attended the University of Egypt, and he was being groomed to become the next Pharaoh. So you can just imagine the money that was spent on developing Moses. But then the second 40 years of his life, he's going to spend on the backside of the wilderness. And he is just going to be just a humble sheep farmer. That's all that he's going to be. And then finally, the last 40 years of his life, Moses was the leader that brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. And in chapter 2, in verse 11, it came about in those days that when Moses had grown up, he went out to his brethren and looked on the hard labors, and he saw the Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Now, you can just imagine how much pride and how Moses must have felt as he goes out to, as we would call it, he went out slumming. He is now this Egyptian prince, and he goes out after he finds that he is Hebrew, he goes down to the slaves. And he's over there with the slaves, and he's talking to them, and I'm sure he really feels good about himself. Hey, I've been schooled by the finest. I live in the palace. And so he goes over there to see them, and he sees one of his brethren being oppressed and beaten by one of the taskmasters of Egypt, and it just flies all over him. It just makes him so angry. And so verse 12 says, so that he looked this way and that, and when he saw that there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian, that he hid him in the sand. In other words, he kills this Egyptian, and he buries him in a shallow grave out in the desert. Now, he thinks everything is okay until he's talking with a couple of the Hebrew slaves, and he finds that they know about the murder that he has committed. Now, you see, he's kind of operating on the premise that I'm going to be a missionary for God. I'm going to go out, and my mission is to help the children of Israel, only to become a murderer. And he's in such a situation now that when the Pharaoh finds out about it, that he has to flee and leave and go into the wilderness and live in the wilderness for 40 years. See, he spent the first 40 years of his life living in the finest, being schooled by the finest, being groomed for the best job in the world, and that was the Pharaoh of Egypt. But now he finds himself a murderer on the run. He which was going to be ruler now is being hunted. He is on the fugitive list, as we would say. If they'd had TV back then, he would have been on that show, Egypt's Most Wanted. And they would have been saying, if you see this man, we need to know about the whereabouts of him. And so Moses has to just totally disappear and lose all of this identity that he had been working on for over 40 years. And he earns a degree out there. Now, he has a degree from Egypt in which he is a very mighty man. But over in the wilderness, he also gets a degree. It takes 40 years. And that is, he gets a PhD in being nothing. That's all he is. He's nothing. He spends 40 years there, and we pick up the story now over in chapter 4, in which you remember in chapter 3, the burning bush, God appears to Moses and he tells Moses that he wants him to lead the children of Israel out. But at this time, Moses does not view himself as a leader. He sees himself as just a humble sheep herder. He's just a shepherd. That's all that he is. And God now is got him prepared in chapter 4, and Moses has been giving him all kinds of reasons why I am not the man to go and do what you want me to do. But while he is talking, God says to him in verse 2, and the Lord said to him, what is in your hand? And Moses said, a staff. You know what a staff is? It's a stick. Some of you I know walk. Hal has a brother that walks, and a lot of times he carries a staff with him, and it's a stick that's been worn. I've been up close to Doug's staff, and you know, over the years, the use of that stick that he carries along with him, and it kind of serves to help him to walk and to fend off a dog or two. I don't know if he has to, wolves or bears in our neighborhood, but he has to fend off a dog every once in a while. And it's a kind of a friend. It fits well in his hand. And this whole shepherd staff now is just this stick that has been used in work. It's been used like a friend. It's something that is lean upon. It is something that Moses kind of considers as just being a part of him. In the morning when Moses would get up and go to work and shepherd his sheep, when he would open the door, he might take his lunchbox with him, but he would reach and grab his staff and take it. And Moses and that staff were inseparable. And he says, now, Moses, what do you have in your hand? That staff, that rod, represented Moses and the work that he was doing. And so he says to him, a staff. And God says, I want you to throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. And notice now, God tells him, Moses, I want you to go over, and I want you to stretch out your hand. Notice verse 4. But the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand and grasp it by its tail. So he stretched out his hand, and he caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. And Moses now is being taught an object lesson. And that object lesson is that what you have in your hand, let me ask you, what's in your hand? You may have a great personality. You may have good business sense. What's in your hand? You may have a lot of strength. What's in your hand? You may have a lot of ability. But until we cast it on the ground and allow God to pick it up, you know something about this rod? From now on, this rod is going to be referred to as the rod of God. Not the rod of Moses, but the rod of God. You see, it is now being dedicated to God. And that's what we're talking about as a selfless life. We sometimes think that, well, if I'm going to serve God, I've got to do this for myself. When God says, no, you're doing it for me. And you turn your life over to Him. And so He says, what is in your hand? Well, what was in His hand? Well, it was just a little stick. That's all it was. But you may have power of speech, personality. You may have a singing voice. You may have the mind to make a lot of money. You may have all these things. But let me tell you, until you're willing to let God use it, and that's what Moses did, isn't it? He let God use that staff. From then on, that staff was going to be involved in the work of God. It was not going to be tending sheep. It was going to be Moses shepherding the people of God. But something had to happen. You see, there was a snake in that rod. And God couldn't use that rod until He got the snake out of the rod. And the same thing is true for you and I. God can't use us until we get self and Satan out of our lives. You got to empty yourself. That's why Jesus said in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, He said, blessed are the poor in spirit. What's He talking about? He's talking about people who are willing to empty themselves of self. He said, blessed, that's when people are going to get happy. Whenever they empty themselves of self. You know, today where my major pain comes from, self. It's what somebody said about me. It's how somebody's looked at me. It's how I didn't get what I thought I deserved to have. Isn't that right? I mean, that's where the major source of our pain, the major source of our discontent, the major source of us not serving God and being all that we can be. I'm going to kind of take that from the army. But being all that we can be is because self is always in the way. But you see, if I can die to self, if I can do like Moses, he threw that staff on the ground, it turned into a snake, and God says, now pick it up by the tail. He picks it up, and it's now the staff of God. And that's what we need to do in our lives. You know, we can ask this question, what is in thine hand? Well, if you look at people like David, he would say 5 small stones. You remember he went down to the brook, he picked up 5 stones, he put 4 of them in his pouch, and he carried one and put it in his sling, and he knocked Goliath's lights out with that stone. What's in his hand? Now, that's a shepherd a shepherd boy going against a giant. What's in your hand, David? A stone and a sling. That's all I've got. But look what great things he was able to do. He was able to complete something that even the greatest of the military minds of Israel thought and viewed as being unattainable. But yet he was going to do it. Let me ask you a question. I want you to look this up in the Bible, see if you can find it. Why did David get 5 stones rather than 1? I can tell you, you can find it in the Bible because Goliath had 4 brothers. And David killed every one of them. That's why he had 5 stones, not just 1. But you can ask the question to the little boy in the Gospels whenever Jesus is gathering the people together and he turns to the disciples and he says, give them something to eat. And of course, they get on their Texas Instrument calculator and they go to calculate and say, man, it'd take a year's worth of wages and we don't have that much money. And where are you going to buy food anyway? There's no food here to buy. And he asked the question, what is in thine hand? Well, just a little boy's lunch, just a couple of loaves of bread and a few fish. But yet, Jesus was able to feed 5,000 with it. What is in thine hand, Mary? Well, it was just a bottle of perfume. That perfume doesn't seem to be that much. But you see, for the business she was in, it was used, but yet she breaks open that alabaster box, as it is called in the King James Version. What's in thine hand? Just an alabaster box of ointment. And she places it upon the head of Jesus. And Jesus says that she's going to be remembered because she was actually serving him. This was a memorial, preparing him for his death. What is in thine hand, widow? Just a mite, just a few mites. That's all, just a few pennies. That's all I have. But yet, notice that God can take those things that we see as insignificant and do great things with them. God can take a few dollars and make them into hundreds of thousands of dollars. God can take a few people with a message and make them into thousands of people with messages. I was reading back in a newsletter that over in India, there were 300 men that stood up and preached in India not too long ago, and literally thousands obeyed the gospel. You see how that works? What is in thine hand? Whatever you have, God can use. Now, this staff that Moses had, there's 3 things about this staff that I want you to notice with me as we think about it. The first thing is that this rod is what I call the rod that led them out of bondage. Turn with me to Exodus chapter 14. In Exodus 14, the children of Israel has already left Egypt and they're on their way. And they're not fleeing being in slavery, but actually they're being led by God out of Egypt. That's one thing that we need to see. They did not flee. As a matter of fact, the Bible says that God led them out. Now, they get down to the Red Sea, and it seems like their road map had a problem. When they get to the Red Sea, there is only just one way that they can go. There's really no way for them to go. If they go to the right, they go to what I guess you would call the desert. If they go to the left, they go to mountains. They can't go back because the army of Egypt is coming upon them. And they can't go forward because there is the Red Sea. But I want you to notice with me what God does for them as he takes them by the hand in Exodus chapter 14. Look in verse 15. As they're crying out to Moses and they're saying, you've brought us out here to die. And Moses turns to God and he says, why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. You see, God doesn't mind if you jump as long as you jump forward. You know, a lot of times when we get frightened, we jump, don't we? Well, he don't want you just jumping straight up. He wants you to jump, but jump forward. What did he say? I want you to go. Which way? Forward. I want you to go forward. And notice that he says, as for you, lift up your staff, verse 16, and stretch it out over your hand over the sea and divide it, and the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea. And that's exactly what happened. God divided the sea. He said, stand still and watch the salvation of the Lord. And he opened the sea. And the children of Israel were able to walk on dry land out of the reaches of the Egyptian army. You see, this is the rod that led them out of bondage. It led them out of bondage. It led them along the way. Now, that way could be kind of tough. We sometimes don't realize this, but the Egyptians, as they were after them, but notice with me three things about the way that God was leading. Number one, it was the way of necessity. It was necessary for them to go this way. God said that I've got to lead them this way lest they get to the land of Canaan and see the Philistines and their hearts grow faint. He said, I've got to toughen them. They've got to become battle hardened before they can go and possess the land. Not only was it a way of necessity, but also it was the way that was forward. It was the way that was forward, that it was the way of opposition. The way of opposition. Notice that there were mixed multitudes that were with them. And that there were all kind of forces that was going on. How many people were telling Moses, you've led us to a dead end? But what did God say? Keep moving forward. Keep moving forward. When the way of opposition come at you, and sometimes we talk about it in this term here, we talk about the fact that the doors of opportunity many times swings on the hinges of opposition. And that's true, isn't it? Not only was it the way necessary, but it was the way of opposition. And then number three, it was the way of faith. It was the way of faith. They had to put their fears behind them and allow God to remove their fear and walk by faith. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, for we walk not by fear, but he says, but we walk by faith and not by sight. We as Christians are to walk not by what we can see, but by what we believe. That's what's important. What you believe is important. And so the way that they were going, it was the necessary way. It was a way of opposition, and God intended for it to be that way. But also it was a way of faith. And then number two, turn with me to Exodus. We're in chapter 14. Go to Exodus chapter 17. It was the rod, the staff that led them not only out of bondage, but that led them out of barrenness as well. Barrenness. Now, when they leave, you remember that when they get on the other side of the Red Sea, they sing the song of Moses in victory. But 3 or 4 days later, they're into the desert and there's no water. And they become thirsty. And God tells them in verse 15, then the Lord said to Moses, pass before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you on the rock of Horeb, and you will strike the rock, and water will come out of it, and that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders in Israel, and whenever he struck the rock, it flowed with life-giving water. Now, have you ever wondered about how much water we're talking about? Moses struck the rock and it brought forth water. Yeah, well, we're talking about like a garden hose in the backyard. Is that what you think? You got to remember, conservatively speaking, there are 3 million people. How long would it take you to quench the thirst of 3 million people with a garden hose? It'd be virtually impossible, wouldn't it? We're talking about a stream of water that is almost indescribable. I am told by the military that if you're wanting to water 3 million people, just to give them the water they need to cook with and to drink, and this is not water to take care of their animals or to wash their clothes. This is just water they need to cook with and to drink, that would take a train of tankers, these big tank cars, a train of tankers over 5 miles long each day. Every day. That's how much water we're talking. Every 24 hours, you've got to have a water supply that at minimum, see, they had donkeys with them, camels, they had all kinds of animals. You're not even talking about watering them. You'd have to fill a train full of tank cars 5 miles long. Now, how much water? See, we're not talking about a water hose. And the most beautiful thing about it is, over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4, that Paul tells us, for that we eat of the spiritual food that they ate of, and we drink of the same spiritual water that they did, for Christ was the rock that the water flowed out of. And so you see, this is not only a staff that led them out of bondage, but it was a staff that led them out of barrenness as well. Is your life barren this morning? Your life can be in bondage. God said the power of a selfless life will lead you out of the bondage of sin, the bondage of self. The power of a selfless life, when you give your life to God, will lead you out of the land of bondage and barrenness. Barrenness. You need the life-quenching, the life-giving water, the thirst-quenching water that flows from Jesus Christ. Now, I want you to go with me to Exodus 17, from Exodus chapter 17. Moses and the children of Israel are going to move forth, and they're going to fight a battle with Amalek down in verse 8. Down in verse 8. Then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. And Moses was commissioned. He is told to go up on the mountain. He says, choose men for us and go out and fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. And Moses did, and he told Joshua. See, Joshua was kind of his general. Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek, and Moses and Aaron and Hur went up on top of the hill. So it came about when Moses held his hand up, that is, he had that staff in his hand and he held it up. Notice what happened. He said he fought against Amalek, and Moses and Aaron and Hur went up, and whenever he held his hand up, that Israel prevailed, and when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy. I mean, you can only hold your hands up so long, and so his hands became heavy. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands and held them up. And Joshua, verse 13, so Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. You see, not only with the power, here's the power of selfless life. It'll lead you out of bondage. It'll lead you out of barrenness. And it will lead you and give you victory in battle. This morning, are you battling something? Sometimes we have to battle things, don't we? It can be discouragement. It can be disease. It can be discontent. It can be depression. Sometimes we battle things. But a selfless life, that staff, that rod of God, will lead us to victory through bondage, through barrenness, and in battle as well. I read a story one time. There was this fellow who was complimenting his wife. And he said, you know, you've always been there for me. Said, I remember whenever I went into business and I lost my shirt in business and we almost had to file bankruptcy, but you was there with me. You was there for me. Remember when I had that car accident, totaled the car, but you was there for me. I can remember you was right there with me. Whenever I was sick and in the hospital, I know you were right there with me. You were right there for me. And he thought of a minute. He said, you know, I'm beginning to think you're bad luck. Well, let me tell you, God's not bad luck. He's going to be right there with you. He's going to be right there for you, isn't he? Through bondage, through barrenness, and in battle. He's going to be there. Turn your life over to Jesus. Power of a selfless life. You know how that begins? It begins by dying to self and dying to sin and dying to Satan. That's why the Bible talks about when we're baptized into his death, that the old man of sin might be put to death. You see, that's getting the snake out of the rod. That's how you do that. And you turn your life over to God. This morning, if you need to put your Lord on in baptism, if you need to die to self, well, let me encourage you to do that. While together we stand and sing.